Hello again. We're back for another round of the pandemic podcast of Westminster Presbyterian Church. Yesterday was Earth Day, and I mentioned Gary Schneider, a Buddhist guy that I quite appreciate. I want to bring forward to you a practice that a lot of people associate with Buddhism, but it's not really strictly Buddhist in any meaningful way at all. What I'm talking about is praying with beads. When I was living in Montreal a few years ago, I had a buddy who left the Presbyterian Church and became Russian Orthodox. He was of a background that made a lot of sense. And the Russian Orthodox Church has a deep relationship with praying with beads and other forms. So he sent me this prayer necklace. It was made by Russian monks, so that's kind of cool. And they have a specific way that they want to pray through this. There's also the rosary, which some people use. The Anglicans have their thing. And there's all these rules around it. And I'm not great with rules. What I wanted to talk about is the value I find in having something that is almost like a fidget spinner. If I pray, if I set time aside, if I try to intentionally create space to spend time with God, what I find is my mind often wanders off into the wilderness. And so having something in my hands that reminds me, right, I'm praying right now, like just something that simple, can be very, very helpful because it brings me back to the intention that I had set, because in the moment I'm wandering away from that intention, and I don't want to wander away from that intention. I want to fulfill that intention. And so the beads can be as basic of a use as that. Now, there are other practices that I've come up with over time. They're not like written in stone or anything. They're just things I like to do sometimes. So I thought I would share a couple of them with you in case you find them helpful. But I would encourage you just to try whatever feels right when it comes to prayer. One of the ones that I like to do is to use the bigger bead as a family member, and then I use the smaller beads as particular prayers I might pray for them, and then the bead right before the big one, I always pray that I would be forgiven where I have failed that person, and also I would pray for guidance about where I might serve that person well. So for instance, I might use the big bead as my wife, and then have a bunch of prayers about her, and then a prayer for forgiveness in that relationship. And then the next one could be my eldest son, prayers for him, and then where I'm failing him and where I could be better. Then the next son, and then the next son, and then the next son, and then there's my dad, and then there's my mom, and then there's my siblings, and you can see how very quickly you've gotten all the way around. You can also do this where you simply pray for a different person or situation with each bead, and then the large beads are Jesus, and you just pray that Christ would be empowering these people or comforting them or healing them or just merciful with everybody or whatever it is. You can really just pray however you like. Sometimes when I'm doing those prayers and I'm just praying for whoever throughout, I'll use the big bead as a prayer of gratitude to remember to be thankful for that which I ought to be thankful. So there's various types of practices you can do with these, and there's not a right way and a wrong way. Don't get caught up in that. The right way is what feels good and what allows you to enter into a real posture of prayer, to add more texture to your prayer time. I've tried a couple other things with beads at times, and we'll probably talk more about beads at another time, but one of them is I had a bracelet that I would use, not this, but I had a bracelet, and I had noticed that when I was in a grocery store, I would be in line and I would always pull out my phone and do whatever to kill time. And I thought a better use of that would be to pull out some prayer beads and pray for the people around me, pray for the grocery store, pray for the farmers, pray for the land. And so I got a bracelet, and I would try to remember to do that. Whenever I had the instinct to pull out my phone when I didn't need to, I would try to say no, and pull on the prayer bracelet instead. For a little while, when I traveled a bit more for work, I had the prayer bracelet, and my eldest son had one, and we committed that we would pray for each other each night as we took them off. You see, it's really up to you how to use these things. I just put them out there because I know a lot of people feel anxious, they feel stressed out right now, and sometimes having something tactile, something to touch, to fidget with, can help us to accomplish whatever it is we're actually setting out to accomplish. In this case, it would be prayer. I want to point out, if you're not a Christian, there are lots of ways you can use beads as well, just to become mindful, to slow down. But if you are a Christian, there's no reason that you can't be praying to a triune God this way, and find any number of good, interesting ways to do so. One other final point about this, I also have a prayer shawl here that was made for me by some ladies or by a woman in my old church. They would make these shawls, and then once a month they would get together and pray over them, and then we would give them out to people who were in distressing situations or were grieving or that kind of thing. And they've always been a wonderful, wonderful tool. And again, it's simply a blanket that I associate with prayer. And so if I have the blanket on, or even if I see it, it reminds me to pray to God, and that itself is helpful. Now you can also go deeper. It can be a comfort of God's love being wrapped around you and that kind of thing. But again, there is just a basic level of when you're fidgeting and you remember, oh right, I'm wearing this specific blanket, my mind instantly knows that this is supposed to be associated with prayer, and I move on with that. The last thing I guess I should say is I'm not encouraging you to go out and buy anything. You don't have to go buy a blanket or knit a blanket or buy beads. You probably have something in your house that you can associate with prayer, and that's good enough. And it doesn't have to cost anything if you don't want it to. One of my mentors once told me to pay attention to where I do my personal devotions, and not to do it at my desk, whatever my working spaces are, but to have it be separate from work, because as a minister there's a lot of overlap and that can get confusing. But for any of us, that's good advice, that there are things that we can set aside in order to remind us of prayer and devotion. These are not magic items. They don't carry any special weight in and of themselves, and yet they can help us. They can bring us back to the center, to the intention that we have set to be a person of God and to come before God. And so again, you can use beads or whatever you like to accomplish these things.